Hello. Today we're going to be taking a look at V-Ray's render settings. Although we've touched on it briefly in a previous lesson, today we're going to go into a little bit more depth so that we have a little clearer understanding of exactly what buttons we should be pushing in order to do what jobs that we want. Okay, so first we're going to do is open up the asset editor and take a look at the default settings. I think yours might be slightly different because I've been doing other work, so I'm not sure exactly if these are the exact default settings or not, but it doesn't matter. We're still going to go through most of these settings anyway. So if you haven't clicked on the gear icon in order to take a look at our render settings, then just make sure that you've clicked on that button. And usually the default setting is for the interactive rendering to take place. And in order for that to get going, we need to click on the render button, and we should get our frame buffer window that opens up to start updating our scene. Okay, so as this works its way to greater and greater detail, that just gives you a quick update as to what's going on to adjust lighting or materials or things of that nature. So depending on the power of your computer, you may or may not want to have the interactive render setup going. I have an older computer, but it's not too bad. But again, I don't normally have it running most of the time because you'll spend a lot of the time just looking at your renderings rather than doing some of the work. So in order to stop the constant update of the window, you can push the stop button, or you can change it from the interactive rendering into the regular style of rendering, which if you click on the button here will give you the regular teapot rather than the one with the hand on it. And then this will just render until you get a completed scene, and even if you move the camera or update something, it won't re-render until you tell it to. Okay, so I'm going to stop that for now. But we're going to take a look at some of these settings. So initially, I always recommend that we have our quality setting to draft. And I'm going to click on this little sidebar here to open up some of the other parameters that I quickly want to discuss today. Okay, so for our greatest effect on speed and quality, obviously, is this button right here. And the draft will be the fastest, and obviously all the way up to very high will be the slowest. I believe I mentioned before that the very high setting for our purposes is something that should be avoided because it's simply far too much detail and computations for us to visually see much of a difference between that and the high settings. Okay, in a future video I'll go into greater detail on how we can set some of these parameters over here to make up for the differences between the different settings but still maintain a decent amount of speed. Okay. Obviously, under our camera settings, these settings won't affect the time it takes for our renderings to happen, but obviously it will have an influence on how dark or light our rendering is based on the exposure or the white balance. So if we want to, we can set this to auto. And if we're going to turn on our auto exposure value, we might as well turn on the white balance as well, and that will help regulate the color temperature of our scene. So if we just do a quick little render of that, we can see how the system will sort of try to balance the light, and if your scene was too dark or too bright or things of that nature, then the auto setting is designed to be able to figure that out at a better way and just get you going. The thing to look for when we use these settings is to click over here on our advanced camera parameters. I'm going to collapse our global illumination. So with the auto settings for this particular scene, the V-Ray has figured out that with an ISO setting of 7500, an aperture of 8, and a shutter speed of 300, that would give us an appropriate amount of light. Okay, but if we shut off these values and let it go back to the default setting that was in there, usually the default is set to something much closer to something along these lines, and you can see how much that has an influence on our rendering over here. Okay, so I'm going to stop that again because I just realized also I had the quality set to high, so that's why it was taking so long to finish up what it was trying to do. Okay, back to some of our other important settings. The render output is critical, obviously, when we are setting up our view that we want to have rendered. Depending on the format where we're trying to present this image, if it's a submission, there might be some requirements that you need to go in here and choose the different setups. If you have a custom amount that you need to put in, or if you wanted to match your viewport and so on, all of these will obviously have an influence. And one of the things that goes with this that is helpful is to have the safe frame button turned on, which is what's giving us these dark bars of darkening the image over here. So with that turned off, then the zooming changes to the view depending on your frame of reference for your actual window. So I'm going to leave that turned on for our purposes so we can see what's going on. Okay. Most of these other settings we're not going to get into a lot of detail about, but one that does come in handy, especially for figuring out lighting early on, is the material override. And when we have that selected, what it does is it basically applies an override color of a mid-gray so that we can figure out our lighting in an appropriate way. So if I were to click on the render button right now, I'm going to stop it so I can set the quality to a lower value. So if we render that now, you'll notice that there are no actual materials applied to any of the objects in our scene. Only the lights are having an effect on the appearance. Okay, so that will give you a much faster result in order for you to see if your lighting is appropriate or not. And again, if you're having trouble balancing the lights or the white balance and so on, you can go back to the camera setting and change the exposure value and white balance to the auto feature if you'd like. And when it renders, those parameters will be adjusted slightly, so you can see how much brighter the scene is now based on the auto settings, which gives us a very different mood, but this is V-Ray's best guess at what it should look like. Okay, so those are the main window settings that we need to concern ourselves with. When we are setting our output sizes, obviously depending on what we're trying to do, we just simply add in the number of pixels that we believe that we need for our images. And if you think about pixels, a typical high definition television, or usually the monitor of a computer screen, is 1900 pixels, 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels high. Okay, but depending on the mode that you're using, if I were to go with the widescreen, which is what a typical computer screen is set up, when I type that in, I will get those default values. Okay, so again, depending on what your needs are, that will have a big influence on. The higher the number, obviously, the longer it's going to take for the rendering to take place. Okay, so So those are our settings that we really need to concern ourselves with in order to just get our regular renderings done quickly. One side note that I want to mention, when we click on the global illumination over here, the default primary rays setting is brute force and the secondaries are light cache. The brute force, while the most accurate as far as calculations go, it is also the slowest. So I almost always set my primary rays to irradiance map just to speed things up, especially in the beginning. And I often set my quality down to draft, because if all I'm trying to figure out is my lighting or things of that nature, then there's no point in having these set to much higher values. Okay, so you can see that if I were to render that now, it would go substantially faster than the last one. But then again, the quality of the output will be a little bit rougher, but you still get the same amount of light information. Okay, and if I were to shut the material override off and re-render it with the materials as they are, then we will get a good indication of the way things will look. And as I mentioned before, that since this is on the auto settings, then it's trying to bump up the level of illumination, and in fact it's changing the mood of the scene that we originally had in mind. So I can easily just shut off the auto settings, and when that's rendered, it will give us a better impression of the level of light that we have set for our scene. Okay, so we could also consider using the denoiser, and that's a handy little feature, especially for quick renderings in the beginning. Actually, I believe this was set to like 12, if I remember correctly. So if we turn on the denoiser, what that does is all these little speckles in our view will get smoothed out after the rendering is finished, which will give us some pretty nice looking results in a short amount of time. So we'll just let that run for a little bit just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So we have a lot of speckles and flecks on the bigger surfaces, which the denoiser usually will do a pretty good job of smoothing out. Let's just see how that looks. And a little bit it helped, but not terribly so. So the other thing to notice about the denoising is there are two different ones. There is the NVIDIA artificial intelligence, or the V-Ray. Depending on what graphics card you have in your computer, if you even have one at all, I recommend leaving it on the V-Ray setting, because if you don't have an NVIDIA card, it won't actually have any effect, and it won't look like it changed anything. So let's see if this makes a bit of a difference on our final rendering. Once it's smoothed out, the denoising can usually have a big impact. So let's see what this does. And the denoising is running right now. You can see this at the bottom information here. Let's see what it does. As you can see, that's a lot smoother, and that actually looks pretty good. So the denoiser is a handy little feature, especially when you're using kind of low settings and just want to get a better idea of what things will look like. Okay, so those are the settings that I wanted to talk about for this tutorial. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks.